Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to more Conversations in the Digital Age. Russia is the foreign relations topic du jour, and there are many questions. What's going on between Trump and the Russians? And what is the best way forward on Russia? Did Putin really hack our elections, as most Americans believe? What did he hope to accomplish? Is there any connection between Russian hackers and the Trump campaign? Do Trump's bewildering statements on Russia that he is prepared to lift sanctions in exchange for an arms reduction deal compute to good policy? Here to help us connect the dots and perhaps shed some light on these questions is Thomas Graham. Tom Graham is a Russian expert who has been watching Putin for years. He has held, among other posts, the position of Special Assistant to President George W. Bush and Senior Director for Russia on the National Security Council's staff. He's a prominent writer on Russian affairs and a managing director of Kissinger Associates. Tom Graham, welcome.
Glad to be here, Jim.
Well, we're delighted to have you. And Joe Biden recently said that he doesn't have a clue what Trump is going to do. Do you have any idea what his Russian policy is going to be?
I don't think anybody at this point has a clear idea of what his Russia policy is going to be. He made a lot of statements during the campaign, during the transition period. If you look closely at those statements, they're not internally consistent. We want to be close to the Russians. We want to work with them on counterterrorism, but at the same time, we want to upend the nuclear deal with Iran, which Russia is a strong supporter of. We're talking about military modernization, continuation of missile defense, two things that send shivers down the spines of people in the Kremlin. So the real challenge here is how do you take these vague sentiments that were expressed during the campaign and translate them into a concrete, coherent policy? That, I think, is going to be a question not so much for the president-elect as it is for the team that he's putting together. And as you know, we still don't know what the outlines of that team are going to be, who are the people going to be focused on Russia policy day in and day out, who are going to provide the options to the president-elect.
Now, specifically, he said he hoped to strike a deal with Putin, this is his most recent statement, to reduce nuclear weapons stockpiles as part of a broader easing of tensions that would include lifting economic sanctions imposed after Russia seized Crimea and made moves on the Ukraine in 2014. He said, and I quote, "They have sanctions on Russia. Let's see if we can make some good deals with Russia. For one thing, I think nuclear weapons should be weighed down and reduced very substantially. That's part of it. Russia's hurting very badly right now because of sanctions, but I think something can happen that a lot of people are going to benefit." Meanwhile, Secretary of State designate Rex Tillerson said Russia poses dangerous threats to the United States. Secretary of Defense Mattis said Russia is one of the U.S.'s principal threats. I mean, how do you reconcile all this?
I mean, obviously, Russia presents a significant challenge to the United States at this point, and it's across a broad range of issues. It ranges from questions of world order, very different interpretations of the fundamental principles of global order, European security, sovereignty, territorial integrity, self-determination, legitimate use of force. And also, we have significant differences over concrete geopolitical issues. You see that most clearly in Syria. You see that in Ukraine. So there are problems that we have to deal with, and I think in this regard, Rex Tillerson and Mattis are absolutely correct that there is a challenge here. That said, I think people realize that Russia is a factor. It does have nuclear weapons. It does have an improved military that we've seen operating in Syria and elsewhere over the past several years. It has a world-class diplomatic corps, and it retains a world-class scientific community that can take the new technologies and develop the military applications. We've seen that particularly in cyberspace over the past several months. So it's a country that we have to reckon with. And the challenge for the United States is to build a relationship with Russia that on balance advances American national interests. We're going to have to engage with them. We need to move beyond what you hear a lot in Washington today, Cold War rhetoric. We're not going back to the Cold War, but nor are we going forward to the type of strategic partnership that three post-Cold War administrations, Clinton, Bush, and Obama, tried. We're going to have something quite different. I think it's going to look more like a normal relationship between major powers with conflicting interests. We're going to have to engage, we're going to have to make trade-offs, and what we're looking for is a balance of competition and cooperation that overall advances American national interests.
Now, President Obama said he wanted to reset our relationship with the Russians, and since he said it, many believe our relationship has done nothing but go south and deteriorated. How do we salvage our relationship with the Russians?
Well, again, remember, the goal is not to salvage the relationship in the sense of building a broadly cooperative relationship. For the past 25 years, American administrations have sought to build a cooperative relationship with Russia on the assumption that Russia was slowly integrating itself into the Euro-Atlantic community. That certainly drove President Clinton's policy. It drove the policy of the Bush administration in which I served, and it was the initial position, I think, of the Obama administration. Putin has made it very clear over the past couple of years that Russia is not interested in Euro-Atlantic integration. It sees itself as a somewhat separate. There's a debate in Russia over whether it's Western, Eastern, Eurasian, but what is clear is that it's different from the Euro-Atlantic community. So integration is not the goal. Salvaging the relationship, to my mind, really is about re-engaging, having a very difficult set of discussions and working towards that balance of competition and cooperation that I talked about in order to advance our national interests. And we go through that issue by issue, but we also need to remember that in the Russians' mind, all these issues are interconnected. There's soft linkage, whether we like it or not, and we're going to have to balance what we do in Syria, what we do in Ukraine, how that impacts more broadly on European security. And also, let us not forget that Russia also plays a role in Asia now. And we also need to have an Asian component to our Russia strategy. So it's a really complicated and complex issue. It's going to take a lot of hard work, a lot of serious and creative thinking in order to build the type of relationship with Russia that is good for American interests.
Now, there's an overarching issue before you even get to any of that, and you touched on it when you referred to their upgraded cyber potential, but they're widely believed to have hacked our elections. John McCain said that this was an act of war against the United States. We're investigating it. I think we've largely concluded that they and Putin were responsible with the intent of influencing the election and securing Trump's victory. Do we do something about that? Obama imposed some sanctions. What do we do? Just erase the sanctions and pretend it never happened?
This, again, is a very complicated issue. First, Russia almost certainly hacked into various computers during the election campaign. That's what intelligence services do. I'm quite confident that the Russians are not the only hostile power that tried to do that during the campaign. My sense is that the goal was not so much to help Trump win, as has been discussed in many elements of the American establishment at this point. I think the broader goal was to discredit the American political process in the eyes not so much of the American public, but of the world. In a sense, said the message, the United States is hardly a paragon of democratic virtue, so how can the United States stand up and criticize Russia for its election campaigns, for the way it conducts its internal policy? And that is a viewpoint that resonates, perhaps not in Europe, perhaps not in the United States, but certainly in broad areas of the rest of the world, Latin America, Africa, and Asia in particular. Now, what should the American response be? First, we do need to investigate this, but we need to put this in a broad context. Yes, there's a Russia element to this, but we also need to look at what other countries might have wished to do us harm, and not ignore the possibility that other countries also engage in less visible ways in trying to manipulate the American political process. Second, we all know that we need to focus on cybersecurity. I was quite disappointed after the initial release of the information on the DNC that both candidates didn't stand up and say, what's really at stake here is the integrity of our political process. This is bipartisan. We are going to both encourage the U.S. government, the American public, to find ways to deal with this. We all need now to focus on cybersecurity, make sure that our electoral process is secure from outside interference. The third thing that we need to do is to figure out how we're going to deal with these leaks of information. They're inevitable. It's going to happen in 2018. It's going to happen in 2020. Much of the focus in the media was on leaks about information about individuals who were acting like normal human beings under stress, trying to do the best they could in difficult circumstances. And yet that became a focal point of discussion that distracted attention from the major issues that are facing the United States going forward. So we as a political society are going to have to figure out how we're going to deal with these in the future so that we keep ourselves focused on what's really important for the United States. And finally, we do have to figure out a way to respond. My own preference would be to do something covertly, something that would send a signal to Russia or other malefactors that we can do harm.
So would you turn off the electrical grid in Moscow for 5 minutes and just to flex our muscle?
Again, those of us outside government don't know what our capabilities are. I think I can describe what we ought to try to do. That is to do something that the Kremlin is aware of that sends a message that we can do much worse if we really intend to, as a way of causing them to reconsider. Much of what is out in the public, I think, is somehow satisfying to the political establishment, but really doesn't deter the Russians. Putting sanctions on GRU officers who probably aren't planning on traveling to the United States anytime soon and don't have a lot of assets in the United States doesn't really send much of a message to the Russians. So again, I think to the extent that this is done effectively and covertly, we're going to be better off.
What about closing down the two Russian-owned buildings, or Russian-used buildings, one in Long Island and one in Maryland?
Again, that will have very little impact on the way the Russians behave. We also have diplomatic missions in Russia that Putin can retaliate against if he so desires. He decided not to.
Do you think that was wise?
From his standpoint, yes.
You can always do it later if...
Absolutely, he made that point.
Yeah.
So basically what he's saying to President-elect Trump is, I haven't done this because I want to see how you're going to conduct your Russia policy, but always remember that this is something that I can do and I will do if it turns out that the relationship is not satisfactory from my standpoint.
Tom, let's look for a moment at conflicts of interest. Secretary of State Tillerson has had dealings with Putin and the Russians over many years in his capacity as Chief Executive Officer of Exxon. General Flynn, the National Security Advisor, has had close ties with the Russians, it said. Trump, at least since 1980, has been seeking business deals in Russia. Does this present a problem? Is this a possible plus for the United States? Because we know the whites of their eyes, or is it a minus?
Let me start with Tillerson. Tillerson obviously is a highly accomplished businessman. He has engaged in negotiations with heads of state around the globe over the past decade or more. He has, in fact, led a very effective policy inside Russia from the standpoint of ExxonMobil's company interest. I think you can transfer that to American national interest. And what I like about Tillerson is that he's tough, he's firm, and he knows how to get what he wants. That, I think, bodes well for a Secretary of State in our dealings with Russia. Russia, in fact, doesn't expect people to roll over. They respect toughness. They'd like to be treated as an equal. And that's what Tillerson did. And if you do that in the diplomatic arena, you're going to have much greater chances of success. Flynn, I know less about. I think he needs to make clear what his attitudes towards Russia are at this point. And I think the same thing goes for the president-elect. It's a tough issue. He has to explain as well as he can what the nature of his relationship has been with the Russians over the past several years, or he's going to continue to face very harsh criticism from the Congress, from the media, and that will impact on what he can do in the policy area. So he needs a coherent policy. He needs to demonstrate how that works to advance American national interest, and then explain as well as he can what the nature of his relationship has been with the Russians over the past several years.
Well, let's take the president-elect, who of course is exempt from the conflict of interest laws, but during the campaign he insulted many people, but he seemed to cozy up to Putin, saying he admired Putin as a tough contender, as a powerful man, and since his election he has spoken well of Putin, and he said, why would we want to be in the Cold War anyway? No one in his right mind would want to be in a Cold War. So how do you reconcile his various statements with a coherent Russian policy?
It is difficult to do. He's putting together a team. They're going to have to take those statements that President-elect has made about Putin, but all the other statements that he's made about various elements that impact on our relations with Russia, and turn this into a coherent, concrete program. That's a very difficult challenge. Any incoming administration faces that. We are, I would say, several weeks, if not a few months away from a fully blown Russia policy.
Let's shift to these talks about compromat. Apparently a Russian tactic of taping American politicians and businessmen in hotels in an effort to get some compromising information about them, which they can use for blackmail or for other purposes. Did you come across compromat at all in your time in government? And is this something that the Russians frequently engage in? Well,
you know, I worked at the American Embassy in Moscow in the late Soviet period in the middle of the 1990s. In many ways, the 1990s, a period of tremendous political disarray in Russia, was the high point of domestic compromise. You used to see this in the papers all the time, various political forces using this against others. To some extent, the intel services in Russia at that point had been privatized, elements of it working for various oligarchs and other major political figures. So I've seen a lot of compromise. I've seen how it's played out in the domestic political environment in Russia. Certainly they've continued to collect compromising information. Again, that's what intelligence services do. And the Russian intelligence service have a long history of doing this. It goes back into the Tsarist period. So I'm not surprised about it. The question is how they might deploy it. But more important than that, the question is how the individuals who might be subject to release of compromise react. If you're concerned about this, do you bring it to the appropriate authorities? Do you go public to demonstrate that you can't be blackmailed, or do you try to hide this in some way? The real danger is trying to prevent the release of that information. You know, what we used to always tell our political officers, our diplomats in Moscow, if you even get an inkling of this, you come to us immediately. We will protect you, but the worst thing you can do is try to resolve this on your own. I think that's good advice for political leaders, not only in the United States, throughout the Western world. If you get any inkling of this, the important thing is to bring it forward, put it out there, and demonstrate that you're not going to be blackmailed by the Russians.
Let's focus on Putin for a moment, if we can. He's certainly portrayed in the press and in Washington circles as an international bad boy, guilty of the worst possible behavior, even as a war criminal. First, his discretion. Does he have more discretion than Khrushchev had? Khrushchev had a Politburo to report to.
Well, it isn't. The point that I always make is that Putin, like any other leader, operates in a political context. He may have a freer hand, obviously, than the President of the United States does, any Western leader does. But there's an inner circle, there are various factions in the Kremlin that have to be managed if Putin is to maintain his political position. He has to demonstrate that he is capable of defending those various factions against one another, against domestic unrest, and also importantly against external enemies. So he has to balance all of this as he thinks about what his own policy is going to be. That's point one. Point two is that Putin operates very much in a tradition of Russian strategic thinking about foreign policy. So from our standpoint, he's challenging us, and I think that's absolutely true. From his standpoint, he's advancing Russian national interests as he sees them, and as I think a broad segment of the Russian political elite does as well. He's going to continue to do that. Our task is to understand, to the extent possible, how he sees his own Russian national interests, factor that into our policy, and make sure that we're responding in ways that deflect what we find disagreeable from our standpoint, push them in directions that are advantageous to the United States, but always, again, on the assumption that he is going to think about this in the context of Russian national interest.
Well, is one of his national interests to restore the boundaries of the old Soviet Union?
It's not to restore the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, to my mind. Putin understands that this is a task that's beyond Russia's capabilities at this point. He would like to have what he would call a sphere of interest that includes the former Soviet space. So I have the droit de regard, what happens in Central Asia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Caucasus, and he would like the United States to recognize that. But this is not going to be the type of politically integrated entity that we had during the Soviet period or the Russian imperial period. Putin, I think, understands that one is beyond Russia's capabilities, but probably is harmful to what he wants to do domestically in Russia at this point.
Well, he's annexed Crimea. He's put pressure on eastern Ukraine. He's certainly expressed a desire to exercise control over Moldova and Latvia, possibly, which is a UN member. I mean, how do we push back against this? I mean, a NATO member.
NATO member, yeah. That's right. First, I mean, if you look at what happened in Ukraine, here, from the standpoint of the Kremlin, I think Russian national interest, Ukraine is a key country. It's the former Soviet state with the greatest economic potential after Russia. Russia would like to have Ukraine as part of this Eurasian economic community that Putin aspires to build. It's seen as a buffer against invasion, and historically Russia has always been concerned about that. So, at a minimum, the Kremlin does not want Ukraine to move westward, to become a part of NATO or the European Union. And the concern about that, I think, motivated the actions in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. And those are both problems for us. We need to respond in some way, but I think we need to understand that that is what motivated Putin. My own problem with the American policy at that point was a failure to anticipate that growing out of the crisis in Ukraine. Now, what do we need to do? What we really need to do is to find a way to end the conflict in Ukraine, to get the Ukrainians to focus on building a competent government, reforming their economy, eliminating corruption. The best bulwark against our concerns about Russian expansionism is building competent states along their border. Ukraine presents a major challenge given the nature of the politics there, but more of a focus on what the Ukrainians need to do to build a competent state, I think would serve the United States well at this point.
Should we be ramping up NATO or disengaging from NATO?
NATO is a fundamental element of American security. It's important to have our allies on board. It gives us leverage in dealing with the Russians. Making it clear that we are going to honor Article 5 guarantees, I think, is important. Rotating troops through Poland and the Baltic states is an important element of that.
Article 5 is an attack on one, is an attack on all.
Absolutely. Now, my only caveat here is that we need to avoid over-militarizing the response to Russia. Russia clearly presents a challenge to the transatlantic community. Russia clearly would like to see less unity, less cohesion. That plays to their advantage over the long term.
Okay, we've got to wrap up, quite unfortunately, because it's been just marvelous, but I have a question for you. Tom Graham, should Trump be so quick to establish good relations with Putin?
You never can do things quickly with Russia. Russia policy, if it's effective, is one of perseverance with a clear goal of what you're trying to achieve.
Tom Graham, thanks so much for coming by. This has been a great conversation. Thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. All the best and take care.